Conservative media this week got very excited about a story from the New York Post about how Kamala Harris's children's book was appearing at a migrant center in California. There was sort of an insinuation there of, maybe this was government provided, even though the article didn't come out and say that. Certainly what was being portrayed was that every migrant that was coming to this welcome center was getting a welcome packet that included Kamala Harris's book, which of course is an interesting story because you think about, like, my gosh, if it was Trump and the art of the deal, people would be freaking out, et cetera, et cetera. This went right into the bloodstream of the conservative news industrial complex. Fox News was doing segments. I think the Trump children were talking about it and weighing in, et cetera, et cetera. Jen Psaki even got a question about it at her daily
she was like, I'll look into it.
At her daily press conference. Well, it turns out the whole thing was completely bogus. And now the reporter who wrote the story has actually resigned from the New York Post. Here is her announcement of resignation. She says, today I handed in my resignation to my editors at the New York Post. The Kamala Harris story, the one we're just talking about the book, an incorrect story I was ordered to write and which I failed to push back hard enough against, was my breaking point. Just a really interesting development in the conservative media ecosystem, which has really had a hard time, like trying to gin something up and then instantly watching it have the legs cut out from under it. Dave Weigel kind of made this point in an entertaining tweet here. To own the libs, you must first learn how to own yourself. Those are two tweets from Lauren Boebert. One about the whole, like, Joe Biden is getting rid of meat by 2030. And then next to it, he's got Fox News host admits that that was not true. Then we've got her talking about the Kamala's children's book, et cetera, et cetera. And you have the New York Post having to completely get rid of that story, and the writer ultimately resigned. So these things are not working out so well for them right now.
No, and I gotta be fair. I think this is a media story more than anything because the New York Post basically lied in its coverage. They
100%.
said, quote, and I'll be honest, I believed it. Like, they said, quote, thousands of copies of Mrs. Harris's book had been distributed at a migrant shelter. And then they repeated it twice. So you're like, okay, well, if there's thousands of these books, like, it can't just be a one-off, right? Like, maybe the government must be buying it. And then they came out. I mean, maybe we'll see whether she was actually ordered to write it or not. Like, that's a real easy way to get off whenever you're working for Murdoch, and I'm sure everybody believes you.
True.
Maybe that's true. I have no idea. But the fact is like, I think this is a terrible media story because they reported it not only wrong, but fantastically wrong on their front page.
So the truth turns out to be that
it was a single book.
People had donated toys, books, supplies. Some random person donated one of Kamala Harris's books that was photographed on the shelter, at the shelter. And apparently this whole story was written off of this picture of this one book. That's it. So, I mean, a dramatic journalistic failure here for the New York Post, and extraordinarily embarrassing for everyone that was involved.
Absolutely. And so, like, these lawmakers and more, like, if you see something about thousands of books, you're like, holy crap, like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like I said, I believed it. I was like, that's nuts.
Yeah.
And then you see this, the whole thing completely fall apart, and you're like, man, this is terrible. I guess in some ways, we should want this for everything. Like, I would love it if people resigned more often.
When they got things wrong.
Things really wrong. There's a lot of people. CNN wouldn't have any more anchors, but that's okay. And I think that it's important to understand that this is both the way the system works, but also this is the danger of fake news. This is why we were so upset about Russiagate and other things, is because it does have real world consequences, which is that somebody asked the White House press secretary about it in a briefing room. Lawmakers tweet about it. People, I guarantee you, we were a day away from some Benghazi style investigation or whatever.
Fox was already sending somebody to
audit the government or something. Rand will take any excuse to audit the Fed. And I think that this, again, shows the danger of fake news, and it really is egregious how bad of a story it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And here's the other thing is, like, so many people will never see the correction.
No, never. This thing was probably shared millions of times.
Yeah, because
it was sent by many people, just so people know.
It hit that, like, I mean, it's one of those stories that, in retrospect, it's like a little too perfect.
Yeah, it is.
It hits that, like, it's exactly what conservatives want to hear about Kamala Harris, that she's like, there's a story of hypocrisy there. There's a story of, like, she's talking about how superheroes show up just in time, even though she hasn't visited the border yet. There's a story about, her ego and her ambition. It fit into the caricature and the mold that they wanted to create of her too perfectly. And so that's why it spread like wildfire. So many people will never see the correction. And then for all of us who do, it's just one more marker of like, you just can't believe anything that these freaking people tell you. And it's not even just like a little miss. Stories are wildly wrong. And you're right to point out that very rarely are there consequences, especially when those mistakes are going in the other direction.
That's exactly right.
More Rising for you after this.